I wasn't sure what to speak about tonight because we have a lot going on in the Torah portion. It's the Yaakov is our third patriarch is reunited with his long-lost son Yosef in Egypt of all places. And of course we have the Siyam Shas, the completion of the Talmud. Once every 7.5 years, people who study one page, which is really 2 pages, what we count pages in English, but the 2 sides of 1 page. If you study that one a day, or 2 pages a day, every single day, without exception, for 7.5 years, you finish the whole Talmud, and that's happening. The main celebration is tomorrow in MetLife Stadium in Parkway Center. I think over 100,000 Jews will be celebrating where they usually celebrate or sometimes mourn over the fate of their sports teams. So we'll be definitely celebrating. There's also a rise in anti-Semitism. I shouldn't say a rise in anti-Semitism, because I don't think there's really much of a rise in anti-Semitism, but there's a rise in the boldness of people who believe that they can act on their negative feelings. So I wasn't sure what to speak about, so I'll try to tie a few ideas together, because really it made me think about many different things. And I'll start that this Erev Shabbos, I went to pick up a couple students of ours who graduated Yale a few years ago, and now they're married, and they live in the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and they are both from the former Soviet Union. They both were born in the former Soviet Union. The young lady was born in Russia proper, and the boy was born in what's today known as the Ukraine. And they became Torah observant at Yale. The boy, completely Torah observant at Yale, and the girl, most of the way, if not all of the way, but she's gone even much further since she graduated. And I went to visit them at the home of somebody who's a big influence to them, and her name is Shifra Zamkov. Now, if you're from Connecticut in this area, you might have met Shifra Zamkov, a very special woman. She's older than anyone here. I think she's well into her 90s. You could have met Shifra Zamkov. Did you meet her? She was the president, she's still the president of the New Haven Society of Holocaust Survivors, which in its heyday had thousands and thousands of members. It could be over 5,000 members, I'm not sure. Certainly thousands of members, and today there are very, very few members left. She was 16 when the Nazis invaded Poland, so you can do your math. It puts her well into her 90s. And so we went to visit her, and she used to speak to our students at Yale, and her health, it hasn't been so strong the last 10 years or so. So we've been visiting her, and some of our students that she spoke to, she made a very strong connection with them. She's a very positive person, brilliant person, very positive, warm, glowing, bright person. And so we went to visit her, and this one student, this young man and his wife, so they became very close with her and very moved by her. So I was speaking to Mrs. Zamkov, and she doesn't have much strength. Her health hasn't been especially good the last year or so. So she was speaking to me only in Yiddish at this point. But I was asking her, she told me about her parents' family. She told me about different members of her family, her mother's mother and her parents, and two of her brothers survived the war by escaping into the woods and marching, I think, 1,600 miles through the Polish forests into Russian forests, finally the most important, the critical part was passing the German lines into Russia itself, and they were taken care of. They had a lot of appreciation, as much terror as the Russians did. The Russians actually took care of them during the war, and after the war they let them go back, and they ended up in New Haven. So she was telling me this is her mother's mother survived, but I asked about her father's side of the family. So she told me for the first time about it. She said that her father's father, I think, had passed away already, but her father's mother, she also had the opportunity to run away with them, but she wouldn't leave because she had a daughter. She had one son and one daughter. The son was Mrs. Zamkov's father, and the daughter was Mrs. Zamkov's aunt, and her daughter was married. And she tried to convince them to leave, but her grandmother wouldn't leave because her daughter wouldn't leave. And her daughter wouldn't leave because her husband wouldn't leave. And her husband wouldn't leave. He said, why? He said, because look, he says, we know the Nazis are going to murder us all. We know that. At that point, they already destroyed most of the town of Dolhinov, a city where, by the way, Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky and Rav Ruderman grew up in Dolhinov. This is where Mrs. Zamkov is from, and she was, considerably younger than them. And she said her grandmother said, or did I say her uncle said, look, we're going to die anyway. why go to the forest to die? He said, you go to the forest, you'll survive for a few more days, a couple more weeks maybe, you'll be eating non-kosher food, and you'll die like animals in the forest. That here, you know what, we'll stay here, we'll eat kosher food, and we'll die like Jews, starben seviyidin. We'll die like Jews. And the truth is, it makes a lot of sense what he said, because that's what it looked like was going to happen, and that's what happened tragically to most Jews in Poland, and most Jews in Germany, and most Jews in every country where the Nazis invaded, with the exception of Denmark, which had tragically one of the smallest Jewish communities. And it made a lot of sense, but it ended up Mrs. Zamkov survived, and her family who went to the forest survived, and her grandmother, her mother's father, and her aunt and their family died. And it got me thinking, and I'm just sharing that story with you. I don't think no one's ever heard that story before, outside of, I guess, maybe Ms. Zamkov's closest family. I think it's not a story she's told very recently, because I have recorded her story many times that she told her students. She didn't tell that part. But it got me thinking, and that is, right, we don't know what's going to happen, right? We don't know what's going to happen with anti-Semitism. We don't know what's going to happen we don't know where certain things are going to lead, right? But Mrs. Zamkov, it seems what she personally did, and her parents did, was the right choice. It's a very, very difficult choice, but they said, look, I think they said the other thing, they said, for sure we're going to die if we stay in Delhina, right? The Nazis already came in here once, they're going to come in here again and clean up whatever they didn't get. The city they could sure find. In the forest, it's possible you'll be able to hide from them. It's possible. It's not very likely. Very hard to survive in the forest, especially if you grew up in a city and never been to a forest before. I asked her, I said, how did you survive in the forest for over 6 months? What'd you do in it rained? What'd you do when it's I couldn't fathom it. And she just sort of laughed. She said, it's just really hard. She was not sure really either, but just somehow they did. Says, but the idea is that you don't give up. Right? You don't give up, and maybe you try whatever the two possibilities are. If one of them has a 0.001% chance, and the other is 0.00% 1 or 0, you go with the 0.00% 1. Right? It doesn't sound like it makes very much sense, because statistically they're almost the same, or maybe identically mathematically. But in Jewish history, the 0.01% is often proven to be very good odds. In fact, it's proven to be amazing odds. Because I'll say that, I'll finish with a more positive thought, that if you look at Jewish history, it's the most unlikely history of any people in the world, far, far and away. And things that for other peoples would have been absolutely impossible, for the Jewish people are typical. And even somebody who wasn't the most traditional Jew, David Ben-Gurion, right, he said that very famously, that a Jew who doesn't believe in miracles is not a realist. And it's funny, but it's the truth. It really works that way. And I'll just end with this final line, this final thought, and this comes from nowhere really, but my Yetzer Hara makes me, sometimes I see an advertisement somewhere for a movie. It looks very interesting to me. I say, look, I'm going to read the review at least. I'll try to read the review, get something out of the review. I'm interested in one movie review I read recently. It was for the newest Star Wars, I can tell you. So they said in the review, something that bothered me. They said they thought it was very dumb. They said because it all depended on the final victory depended on this complete coincidence, this plot point that wasn't foreshadowed at all, absolute coincidence, and it's just not believable. It's not believable. If anything in Star Wars would be believable, but it's not believable. But it really struck me because I said, in Jewish history, right, these, not just in Jewish history, but in the life of every single Jew and every single person, I think, maybe in the world, right, these things that is something that's like absolute coincidence, that someone's in such a desperate situation, and the only way they could get out of it was something that was completely unlikely, it wasn't foreshadowed, and it made no sense, and there's no way you could have hoped for it to happen. But almost everyone in their life has one of those things that really saved us from some trouble. And the Jewish people, it happens time and time again. So with such an unlikely event as the Siyam Shas, the completion of the Talmud, with over 100,000 people attending here, just in the New York area, let alone in all these different cities, let alone across the rest of the world, and the miracle of that, right, after the destruction of the Jewish people in such it seemed like an almost complete way at the end of World War II, at the end of the Holocaust. So with this tremendous celebration, we should remember that Jewish history in all of our personal lives depends really, and somehow been saved by a number of very unlikely things that couldn't be predicted. And the main thing is to hold on, right? To keep trying and not to give up in whatever situation we're in our life. To try to always to choose the path where maybe this I'm not going to give up. I can always give up tomorrow, right? Today maybe this will work. For the Jewish people, that's been a formula for absolute success, and I wish all of you continued success in your learning and everything else. We should merit to continue to see and be inspired by the tremendous, sometimes unexpected turns of events which have flowered into great success and salvation for the Jewish people at all times.